please welcome Mr. Akshat Joshi, CEO of Humanica Consulting Services. Over to you, Akshat.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Akshat, and I'm so happy to have all of you with us here today. We are going to discuss a very important topic that I think in this day and age is something that we need to pay attention towards. As we know, we are going through a rather difficult economic climate. There are recessionary fears pretty much everywhere. And when you go through a time like this as an organization, you want to be able to prepare yourself for the next phase of growth. Any difficult economic time, any recessionary time is actually a good time for us to really review how we are doing things today, so that we can run them faster, leaner, better, those kind of things, and be prepared for whenever there's the next phase of growth. So that's the topic today: how to optimize your HR function from a cost efficiency perspective. And just the agenda today, as you can see in front of you. Firstly, we'll try and understand what exactly is cost efficiency, because there's a difference between being cost efficient and reducing costs, two different things. Then today I have three levers, three ways of making your HR more cost efficient. The first one is around measuring and analyzing data. The second one is around standardizing your operations, how you do things. So one standard way of doing things. And the third one is about continuous improvements, because when it comes to any kind of efficiency, you can't do it just one time and forget about it. So you have to continuously improve. And how do we do that? There are many other ways as well, but these are the top three I would think that organizations should consider. And we can talk about other ways as well as we go along. And towards the end, as you know, we have a short Q&A, and I think we have some quiz for you and some prizes to give as well. So we'll do all that. Okay, so let's start by understanding what exactly is cost efficiency. Now, some of you may know this very, very well already, but just so that we set the right context for the remaining conversation, ultimately, cost efficiency is about finding a balance. It's a balance between cost, quality, and productivity, right? So it's not just cost reduction. So let's look at this slide, where cost efficiency, I would define that as a ratio of benefits on cost. So per dollar, per baht spent, what is the benefit we're getting out of it? That essentially, that ratio is the efficiency ratio. Now, what are benefits? In HR world, benefits could be many things. It could be your employee engagement levels, for example. It could be the productivity, performance levels that you see in your organization, the agility, the collaboration, how many employees are upskilling themselves. Some of these things can be difficult to measure, but others are easier to measure. But these are the benefits of running a good HR function, providing the right policies, the right processes, the right environment and culture. We see these benefits, right? Now that is then upon, you can see the costs, which is primarily, if we talk about HR as a function, that is HR headcount related costs. So obviously, you've got your HR leaders, you've got specialists, you've got generalists, country HR, maybe business unit HR. There are so many ways of organizing. So there's the headcount cost, which is directly the cost. And the second thing would be the general operational cost, I should say, right? So perhaps you have a vendor where you outsource your payroll, your benefits, maybe learning administration even, right? Maybe you have some licensing fee that you give that you pay for the software you've got, right? The HRIS system you may have. So all those things, and then the general administration expense, all those things will add up as so basically, we're talking about maximizing the benefit. So you want the numerator to go up as much as possible, right? So you want engagement levels to be high. You want performance to be high. And then you want the costs side of the story to be as low as possible. You don't want to have too much directly cost within your HR function. You don't want to have, typically, you don't want to have too much operational costs. And that, at the end of the day, is the ratio that we try and aim at. We try and maximize benefits, we try and minimize the costs. Which essentially is the diagram you see there, right? So typically, HR firstly as a function, if you look at all the jobs that HR does, they can be classified into 3 buckets. I think many of us might be familiar with that concept, but again, just to refresh our memory, there is the strategy side of HR, which is, thinking about how do you create a competition in the market, get the best talent, have the right productivity levels. The strategy side of things. What's your performance strategy and framework? What's your talent management strategy? Those kind of things. So there's a strategy jobs. Then there is the operations job, which I would call as middle office jobs, right? Just setting a strategy is not enough. Someone has to actually operationalize it. Someone has to run around and do some things in order to sort of make that strategy real, and that's operations. Usually your country HR generalist, they typically are involved in HR ops. And the third bucket is what I'll call administration. This is paperwork, in other words, right? So there is the middle office jobs where you are running the show. Let's take an example. If you have a recruitment, we talk about recruitment as an area. You may have a recruitment strategy that defines the talent profile that you have, and then where will you source that talent from? What exactly will be your value proposition against competition? That's the strategy part of it. Operations is actually getting those candidates in, operationalizing the selection process, and then at the end of it, there will be paperwork, right? Some administration to be done. There'll be a lot of forms that would have been filled. Perhaps you want to make an offer to some candidates, and you'll need to do contracting. So this concept can be applied to pretty much everything you look at, not just recruitment, strategy, ops, and admin. And typically, in most organizations, the amount of headcount, HR headcount that is allocated, if you look at it on a per transaction basis. So one candidate, for example, coming in, becoming an employee is one transaction, let's just say. The maximum amount of headcount allocation typically goes into administration and operation, not so much on the strategy side of things, because there's no time left once you're done so much, once you're dealing with so much of administration and operations, right? From a cost perspective, though, if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, the ambition should be to maximize your per transaction cost allocation on strategy, right? Which basically means you need to invest more on strategic matters. That at least is what I recommend. And try and reduce the investment on administration and operational matters. And there are many ways to do that. You can digitize things. We'll talk about a few of those things subsequently. But that should be the ambition. Now, this is not a black or white statement. You can't necessarily exactly do what I'm suggesting, but it should be a guidepost for us. If we try and achieve this, then most likely we'll find a middle ground where our costs are balancing out well between strategy, operations, and administration. So that's the first point I wanted to make. Those 2 points, I guess. First one, cost efficiency is not about cost reduction as such. It's about efficiency, which means it's a ratio, which means you got to maximize the benefits and you want to minimize the costs. And that's point number one. Point number two to remember, I think, here is that as an ambition, you want to maximize your investment on a per transaction basis on strategic matters, because that's what creates differentiation between you and your competition when it comes to finding and retaining the best talent, right? Some other things over there you can see quickly, just the bullet points. We want to make a distinction when you're looking at your costs and you're analyzing your HR costs. You want to make a distinction between direct labor costs and vendor expenses, licenses, those kind of things. Although all of it is important, obviously at the end of the day, it's all HR spend. But you do want to make that distinction, because the way of reducing costs in both these things, whether it's direct labor costs or vendor expenses, is slightly different, right? In one case, you might want to think about how many people you need and what they're doing. And in the other instance, you might want to renegotiate your SLAs or think about the scope of what the vendor is providing. So anyway, that's the one thing you should kind of keep in mind as you start analyzing your HR. What is cost efficiency not? I think I've answered that already. It's not cost reduction. It is finding a balance, right? So my suggestion to anyone who is looking to create more cost efficient HR operations is, please do not exclusively choose between cost, quality, or productivity, right? That's sort of like the trinity of efficiency, right? Cost, quality, and productivity, and they're linked. Many of us might understand this concept already because it applies not just to HR, everywhere actually. Because if we exclusively choose one of these dimensions, we run the risk of making a mistake on some other dimension. So for example, let's say we aggressively pursue cost reduction exclusively, right? Quality may suffer. Quality suffers, productivity suffers. So it's not always a good thing, because then the business outcomes that we wanted to achieve, we are working against that actually, right? So what you do need to do, what you do need to think about though, is how do you prioritize between these three factors, right? So yes, it's about finding a balance, but given the situation your organization is in, and given what you perceive will happen to the organization in the next 2-3 years, at least in the short to mid run, you may have certain priorities. One organization, might, for example, might think that productivity is their number one priority, followed by costs, followed by quality, maybe because quality is not an issue so much, productivity is. In some other organizations, it might be all about costs, right? So cost reduction is the number one thing because they've already realized that their current costs are a little bit on the overside, over bloated a little bit, and they can reduce that, right? In many other cases, quality could be number one priority because while they're doing it, running the HR operations in a reasonable cost, as well as in a very productive manner, the error rate is quite high, or the results are not there, right? So then we have to think about, from a quality perspective, what exactly needs to be fixed. So it's a balance, but have a prioritization between these three dimensions, and always remember that when you make changes in one of those dimensions, there are implications for the others. So that's what the balancing act is all about. An example on how, a quick one, on how not finding that balance can result in unintended consequences. One of the international retailers, this is a fast fashion company, a brand I think we'll all be aware of, but I can't name them, figured out that to be more productive and have a more productive workforce, this is a retail setup, so people go to these stores, right, in the malls and all these retail shops, and so they wanted to bump up their productivity significantly, and they went for an automated scheduling software, rostering software, where the retail staff would automatically be allocated which store they need to go into, right? Now, conceptually, the idea is great, right? You might think, okay, the software can do a much better job at scheduling things and rostering people, and so productivity levels will go up. But actually, the mistake that was made here was not thinking so much about other things. Like, they never consulted the retail staff, the managers who knew what kind of constraints in real life that can happen, and the software ended up sort of randomly allocating people on a little bit ad hoc, and that resulted in essentially a very high burnout for the staff, right? Burnout levels went high, they were not very happy, a lot of them quit, and that resulted, at least in the short run, they had a bit of an issue serving their customers properly, because all the good employees, when they quit, they don't like it, then of course there'll be an issue on the customer satisfaction front. So it's something that backfired. Eventually they were able to fix all of that, but I just bring that example to try the point that don't be exclusively focused on any one aspect. It's a balancing act. Okay, so that is the definition of cost efficiency, what it is not. And let's talk about how exactly do we be cost efficient. Now, like I said, there are many ways, but I've chosen these three. I think these are very relevant in today's world. The first one is around, like I said, measuring and analyzing. So what we'll be talking about here is a little bit about HR benchmarking. So some of you may have been part of a benchmarking project, and if so, then you might find this very interesting. For others, I'll attempt my best to cover this complicated topic. I have an example for you as well today on how benchmarking can help. So the first one is around that. We need to measure. The second one is about standardization, right? And here we're, of course, talking about processes, policies, but I also want to talk about, like I said, it's always a balancing act, right? We also want to talk about the employee experience perspective when we talk about processes. You don't want to standardize a process, but nobody likes it. That also will backfire, and it's not a good thing. And the third thing, like I said, something we need to kind of make a part of our culture already, which is continuous improvement, right? This means consulting the right kind of specialists, having the right kind of specialists in-house. If you need an external expert, get one, because no person can be an expert on every topic out there. So I think it's a good idea to kind of think about how will you make continuous improvements, and we have some ideas there. Today we'll share some innovative stuff with you on that as well, okay? So that is what we'll talk about today. The first measure is about, the first lever is about measuring and analyzing, right? And like you see on the slide, you can't fix what you don't understand, right? Quite obvious. So that's why we need to kind of go through these benchmarking exercises. For those of us who don't understand benchmarking as a concept very well, essentially, we look at our own HR performance on cost, quality, and productivity, and there is a certain way of measuring all that. And then you compare it with an organization that is similar to yours. You will never find a perfect fit, usually won't, but similar to yours, and that sort of helps us figure out whether we are on the right track or not, or if we need to kind of fix a few things. So let's get right into it. Measuring and analyzing, I think the number one thing you should consider is HR benchmarking, which is about really measuring and comparing the time and cost of HR and comparing it to a similar organization, right? Now, the topic of benchmarking can also be a bit scary for some people, right? Because every organization has a unique context. They have their own constraints. They have their own strategy. And sometimes when you compare yourselves to another organization, the context is lost, right? So while you may say, oh, their costs are lower than ours, they have lesser people than us, and they are able to run more transactions than us, that's fine. But I mean, so that does not mean necessarily that this is a bad thing, right? What we need to understand is, okay, if we are, let's say we have more headcount than another organization similar to us, and more HR headcount, and we are serving the same things, the question to be asked is it a strategic choice or is it by accident, right? You'll see this theme again when we talk about continuous improvement. If it's a choice, then it's fine because that's the cost of that choice. Why would someone choose like that? For example, these big tech companies, the famous ones, the FANGs and such, they typically do not worry too much about their HR to employee ratio. I mean, it's not like they don't worry, that would not be correct thing to say. But their HR to FTE ratio or HR to employee ratio, meaning how many HR people for 100 employees, let's say, right, that ratio, can be on the higher side. So which means because the kind of talent that they are trying to recruit and retain they need a lot of high touch service, as I call it, right? So they need to be engaged quite a bit. A lot of interventions need to be done, those kind of things to sort of keep them engaged and motivated and retained, right? If we talk about another organization, let's say that is, on the manufacturing side of things, just making an example up again, it's not necessary every manufacturing firm would be like that. Over there, in those kind of setups, typically you would be focused on being as lean as possible, right? So no waste, because that's the culture, that's the DNA of that organization. So again, it's not to say that the high-tech company is doing the wrong thing or the manufacturing company is doing the wrong thing. No, they are just making strategic choices based on the nature of their industry, the nature of the talent, and the culture and the DNA of the organization, right? So those things matter, which is why I say benchmarking, yes, absolutely go for it, but be very careful what you're measuring against, and just make sure that the way your organization ends up looking is supplemented with that context. Don't just go by numbers. Look at the context, look at the numbers, then you have your answer. So as you can see on the screen here, some sample calculations, pretty straightforward actually. Calculations are not so much of an issue. You just need to kind of find the right data. That's how you calculate the cost of HR service delivery. The one thing I'll have to say, so basically you look at, the average cost of your HR individuals and how many people do you have, HR people do you have, and then you divide that by the total employee count. That's called the HR FTE ratio or the HR to employee ratio in the benchmarking world, right? What you do want to do here, my suggestion would be to not just look at overall HR cost, so just take the HR cost and divide by total headcount. That's okay, but that's the top level ratio. What's also important is how much of the HR FTEs are being spent on strategy versus operations versus administration. The three things we spoke about on the previous slide, because you want to be sure how much are you spending per strategy, per headcount per strategy kind of a thing. And the same thing for operations and the same thing for administration. So that would be one suggestion I would make when you start looking at the cost of your HR services. Segregate strategy, operations, administration. Separate those three costs, and of course you add it up and it becomes the total cost. And one good thing to do is also not to sort of look at these ratios from a headcount perspective, but an FTE perspective, right? Most of us are HR folks, I imagine on this call, and should be quite familiar with the full-time equivalent concept. So you do want to look at the FTE. We have an example coming up and we'll talk about that FTE in a little bit. But you want to look at that and you want to look at the average amount of time you are spending on various things, right? So for example, the second formula you see down there, if you are trying to identify what percentage of HR's time is spent on, let's say, strategy matters, typically someone in a COE role or center of excellence or an expert is involved with strategy. And so you want to see how much time is that person, that COE spending, divided by the total time that all HR people spend in your organization. So that gives you a ratio on strategy. You can calculate very easily a similar ratio for your shared services people, for your operations people, generalists. Obviously, you just change the numerator and the denominator remains the total time spent, right? Now, a couple of things would like to draw your attention to the 5 points I make before I start talking about one example on how benchmarking helps. The 5 points there, I think, are quite important. Firstly, when we embark on a benchmarking exercise, when we start a benchmarking exercise, we have to be open to and willing to accept the findings, good or bad. That's fine, right? We have to start with measuring correctly, making adjustments correctly, and I'll explain what I mean by adjustments. That's the case study coming next. But we have to be mentally prepared that the results will be what they will be, and we'll figure out what to do. Because many a times we get scared already when we start measuring things and we go, oh, what is the agenda here? The agenda really is to find the truth. The agenda is to compare ourselves with others. The agenda is to improve. That's the agenda. So let's be open and willing. We also want to compare apples to apples. So you don't want to compare yourself with another organization that is in a completely different sector, completely different cultures, completely different strategic choices. You want to choose a benchmarking group as close to yourself as possible. Now, we also need to understand that no benchmarking analysis will be absolutely 100% perfect. It's very, very rare that you will find a situation like that. Most organizations have something different about them, something unique about them, and that matters quite a bit. So you may want to make some adjustments, and I'll show you that in the example next. The other thing I'll say is form a hypothesis up front, right? So typically, either before you start the benchmarking exercise, have some initial hypothesis on what you think might be going on, because that will help you focus on the right kind of ratios. The two examples I'm giving you today, obviously, is not the complete list. This is just very high level stuff you can do right away, actually. You can calculate this yourself. But there are a lot of details under this. So when you have a hypothesis, you have an assumption up front saying, I think maybe our quality is an issue. I think maybe on the cost side of things, or maybe I think we're not spending enough time on strategy. Maybe we're spending too much time on administration. That will give you an idea on what data points to track and measure and look and then compare, right? So that's the other thing. And finally, I think I said the fifth point already. context matters. It's not just about numbers. Context matters. So don't forget that one, please. Now, benchmarking is fine, but the real value is in making decisions, right? You don't do a benchmarking exercise, you don't do a measurement exercise just for the sake of measuring things. Ultimately, the idea is to identify what could be improved and then go ahead and improve that, interventions to close those gaps, right? So I'll show you an example on how this particular case study is for a pharmaceutical company based in Southeast Asia. I think they're or Asia Pacific, I should say. They're pretty much in every country, a big brand. And they had a fairly sizable HR team, I will say. But it seemed like while they have so many HR people, they were always very busy. Everybody was busy all the time. And so that was the problem statement, and they came to us and they said, listen, we have a lot of people, but it seems like we're busy all the time. So is there something we are missing here? Is there something we can fix here, right? And some of the basics were in place for this organization. So clearly we had to investigate a little bit. And when I say some of the basics, meaning they have some basic HR systems, they had a shared service, they have COEs, they have generalists. So the roles were defined. So it's not like we were looking at an organization that isn't organized at all, right? Now, the problem that the HR leadership was running into is that they were not getting additional headcount, permission for additional headcount from the business leaders, because when they look at the ratio, the HR to FTE ratio, HR upon headcount, HR headcount upon total headcount, that ratio looked, obviously it said that you have a lot of HR people, and they were basically saying that, okay, your ratios are already on the higher side of things, so we don't think we can make further investments into HR. At the same time, the problem with that HR was facing was that the business was growing at a pretty rapid pace those days, and they were looking at about 25% headcount growth over the next 3 years. And the HR leadership was quite worried that if we don't get more hands on deck in the HR team, how exactly will we hire these people, onboard them, those sort of things, right? So it was a legitimate concern. So the starting point for us was to really understand, what might be the potential issues and underlying reasons, hypothesis, right? We haven't really analyzed all the numbers just yet. This is about us talking to people, right? So you could do the same. You could start with formulating some hypotheses. You can see some examples here. This is not the full list, but I'll walk through some. One issue that was identified was that everyone in HR does everything all the time, right? Like I said, they had some basic roles defined, but because the workload seemed to be so high and, like I said, they were busy all the time, basically everyone ended up doing everything, right? And some of us might be going through that in our organizations. It's not as uncommon as you think, but everyone was doing everything at all times. This had to do a little bit with the lack of demarcation of roles. While they had been defined, they weren't being followed as much. This is all just possibilities, right? So what you see, probable reasons. At that time, we didn't know what was the real reason. Like I said, they had their roles defined. But one of the hypotheses we had up front was, maybe you haven't defined these roles very well, right? But that was not really the case. It was more, like I said, it's just fighting fire all the time because the workload is very high. And there are a couple of other hypotheses or probabilities that we ascertained before we started. It's possible that HR has been managing all the administration work forever. So should HR even do that? Maybe they don't have enough resources, and that's what leads to this kind of a crunch. Maybe there are not enough budgets for them to even hire a proper team. Maybe they are undersized, in other words. So those were some possibilities we thought of. Another issue that we identified early on, talking to people in HR and leadership and management, was that employees in this organization almost expected HR to support on non-HR matters, right? And what do I mean by non-HR? It's like, in this organization, believe it or not, HR was involved in general office administration as well, right? So I'm talking about getting the stationery. I'm talking about keeping the pantry well stocked, right? I'm talking about fleet management. So they had taxis that used to bring their employees in, and all of that general administration, anything that breaks down in the office, again, HR is involved. If we are celebrating somebody's birthday, HR is involved. HR is bringing the balloons and doing all that. So nothing wrong with all that, but like you could do that if it's a strategic choice that you make. But you have to understand that when you do that, you're essentially creating more work for HR, right? Because these are not core HR jobs. So anyway, but employees expected it because that's how it has always been. Again, we made some postulations, we made some guesses on what might be driving all of this. But eventually, when we did the benchmarking, we found out what the real reason was. Another issue that we saw there was managers in this organization, middle management I'm talking about, right? They needed very high touch support on people matters. By high touch, I mean they need a lot of coaching, a lot of guidance, a lot of sitting down and talking to them. So if we ask the manager to do performance calibration, for example, in this organization, they wouldn't know how to do it, right? So they will need someone from HR to sit down with them, walk them through all of that, policy, and consult them, guide them. Then they will kind of go ahead and make a calibration. If one of their employee quits, they want to retain that staff. Again, the manager was not, the culture was such that the manager would not go ahead and take that initiative of talking to that employee, see how we can retain him or her, what would it cost the organization, make those decisions. That was not the culture. The culture was to bring HR in, and HR is supposed to retain. Now, again, I'm not going to say that this should not be the way, but in leading organizations and leading practices, managers are a lot more responsible for their people, and they take these decisions themselves, right? So HR's job is to give them the process, the policy, enable it, train them on how to manage people, and then they manage their own people. Day-to-day administration like this, people management, should be the people manager's job. That's why we call them people managers, right? So anyway, that was another issue that was identified. It was a long list. There were issues around data. There were issues around technology. Some of the shared services that they had was not operating optimally. But I just picked a few to kind of make the point, right? So you start with a hypothesis. In this particular case, we had some hypothesis there. Now, then we start with the number crunching, right? So we actually go ahead and, just like the formula you saw earlier, we looked at how much time is the strategy or COE spending on across process areas, by the way. So if you've got to start with recruitment to onboarding, talent management, meaning performance, succession, learning, exits, all of that. So across the HR value chain, you look at how much time is being spent on strategy versus operations versus administration, right? Now you can see the results over there. So obviously this is a lot of calculation because there was multiple business units in this organization and so on and so forth. But once we added those numbers up, the picture started to become extremely clear, right? This is the amount of time that you see the graphs on the bottom, the pie charts. This is the amount of time that the HR organization worked, right? So as you can see, most of them, 82% of them, worked overtime. Now, in this particular organization, overtime did not mean anything monetary, so it was just overtime. And sure, I mean, many of us work more than 8 hours in a day. But the point I'm trying to make here is that if 82% of your HR people are working more than 8 hours every single day, I think for them it was more around 12 hours every single day, then something is wrong about the way the jobs have been allocated, or something is wrong about the way we have maybe not utilized digitization and automation as much, because it should not be this way, right? I'm not saying everyone works 8 hours only, but it should not be 82% of HR all the time, right? Then we looked at, okay, where exactly are you spending time? We know that HR is working a lot. That has been established. We know that they work overtime quite a bit. That has been established. But what exactly are you working on? And we actually went out and started to time some of these activities that these people are working on, right? And what we found was another very interesting insight that, on the whole, while 82% of the time they were working on what I would consider core HR activity, a good roughly 18%, roughly 20% there, nice 80-20 split in both cases, was spent on non-core HR activities. I would even call them non-HR activities, right? So like I said, fleet management, office administration, booking rooms, and these kind of things. Now, someone has to do it. You might say, listen, but that's how we also are. And HR always used to take care of administration. Someone's got to do it. And you're right, someone has to do it. And I'm not suggesting that, I mean, if that's the way your organization is structured, I'm not suggesting that HR stops doing that because, how else will the business operate? But when we start comparing HR FTE ratio for an organization like this with another organization, right, like a benchmark organization, then we're not comparing apples to apples, right? So we need to make adjustments, and that's what we did. So here, for example, you see, this is a simple 2x2. There's a lot more details, but I'm trying to keep it pretty straightforward today and like give you a cursor, like an overview. It was clear HR is spending a lot of working quite a bit, and then they're also spending a lot of time on non-HR administration. So we actually had, on FTE basis, we had calculated the amount of time they're spending, right? So here you can see, so what we did was we said, okay, standard working hours, we'll assume 8 hours. And the reason we're doing this standard working hours is because any benchmarking database that you'll find out there in the market, any good one at least, kind of assumes it's an 8-hour workday FTE basis, right? People actually work more than 8 hours, that's another matter. But then you're comparing the right things. So standard working hours and then overtime hours on the columns, you can see. And then on the x-axis on the foot, you can see how much of core HR, how much of it was. And when you start looking at those numbers, the situation is very clear, right? As you can see, there's 20% of it done in non-core HR and overtime. If we take all of that out and we look at the ratio of HR to employees in this organization, they were quite close to median. So normally any benchmark will provide a range, right? So here, for example, you can see the low range is 1.36, high range is 2.25. These are the numbers have changed a little bit to protect client confidentiality, but just to make a point, right? Typically there'll be a range. It's not one number. And as long as you're close to the median or even within the range, it's considered okay, because there can always be a little bit flexibility on what your ratios end up looking like. It can't be like one number. But they were quite close to median once you adjust, meaning you take out the overtime, you take out the non-core HR, and then they are close to the median. And if you remember, we started with the problem statement where business leaders were not allowing for more headcount in HR because their ratio looks quite high. So if you count everything in, then yes. The other thing that we were able to identify and appreciate was that if nothing changes, if no additional headcount is approved for HR, essentially if we adjust for that, like number of employees, right? So HR FTEs upon headcount, overall headcount, that will continue to grow about 25%, which means that the ratio for HR to FTE will go below the low end of the range, which means you have too few people in HR to serve that big an organization, right? And but when these kind of things happen, then the service quality will suffer, right? So you can save costs, but your quality goes down, and that's not good either. So as we did this analysis and we were able to explain the underlying reasons, I think it was very nice for both HR leaders and business leaders to really understand and appreciate what was going on. And of course, I mean, in this organization at that moment, they could not immediately split HR and administration, but they decided to do that eventually. So you can see some of the interventions that we helped identify. Like I said, it's not about benchmarking per se, it's about identifying the intervention. So here, for example, in the short run, of course, some additional budget was allocated to meet the needs of the growing headcount. There was also a conversation around perhaps they can use their vendors in a little bit better manner. So they did have some level of outsourcing going on, especially payroll, I think, if I remember. And they were able to renegotiate the SLAs so that they can offload a little more on the vendor, which of course frees up time for HR as well. In the medium term, like I said, they said that, okay, HR and general administration should probably be two different departments, and HR only focuses on HR work. This helps not just with the ratios, but it also helps with focus, if you ask me, right? It's not so much about should HR not do administration at all. To me, it's about focus, right? When your job is defined as HR and you're not taking care of the rest of the things, administration people can also kind of focus on the administration part. So it's about focus. And then we also identified the need to train employees and managers to utilize the existing HR technologies. Like I said, it's not like they did not have anything. They had, it could be improved, but they had some basic HR technology, some basic reports available for the employees and dashboards, some level of self-service, very little, but some level of self-service. But even employees and managers weren't even using what was available, right? Forget about upgrades, which eventually I think they did go ahead and upgrade their technology with a modern system, but that happened a little bit later. In the interim, you can already start to train your employees and managers to take accountability for their people transactions as long as they have the tools available to do that, right? So employees should be keeping their records updated using self-service. Managers should be able to pull out a report and decide on people management matters rather than pulling HR into every conversation, right? So that training was also done. And like I said, in the long run, they did upgrade to a more modern solution where about 70% of the transactions were self-service with an app, and those all the leading cloud technologies these days can do that. So does Workplace from Humanica, but they went and implemented something like that. So that is the first lever, first method of being more cost efficient. The second thing I want to talk about is standardizing operations, right? And like I say, there's beauty in simplicity, right? The catchphrase that I always use for standardization is keep it simple, keep it standard, keep it global. And by global, I mean global geographically for your organization, whatever the footprint you have, right? So keep it simple. That's important, but also keep it standard, right? Let's try and understand a little bit more on this. We use the words standardization and harmonization. Sometimes many of us use them interchangeably, right? When that is actually not the case. There's a difference between standardizing something and harmonizing something. When we talk about standardization, we're talking about absolutely one way of doing things, right? Exactly the same steps. So if you're talking about process, for example, a standard process would be, when we onboard somebody, here's the 7 steps, for example, that we follow. And then no matter which department, which business unit, which country you go to in your organization, everybody follows those 7 steps, as an example. That's a standardized process. Everything about it is the same. A harmonized process is where you have some variation, some allowance for individual country needs, yet all of it works together in unison. All of it works together harmoniously. So that's why we use the word harmonization. So there's always some allowance for variation in harmonization. And there are many, especially in HR, there are so many legal regulatory requirements depending on the country you're talking about. There could also be some variation simply because of cultural reasons, like maybe one business unit likes to do things in a certain way, and that's their differentiator in the market. That's how they keep their best talent. So there can be differences, right? But what you want to do is harmonize it. So as an example, let's say same thing. We want to onboard people, and to onboard, we said there are 7 steps. But on step 3, let's just say the way we do step 3 in Thailand is different from Malaysia, is different from Vietnam. So be it, right? We can at least define what that step 3 in each country is. It's also called localization sometimes. In each country is, and we make sure that we are able to run it in the same sequence though. So everyone goes through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up to 7. Step 3, everyone does it in their own way. That is a harmonized process. So it's not exactly the same, but overall, if you look at it, it works as if it was standard, right? So that's the slight difference. Now, why do I make such a big emphasis on standardization versus harmonization? Is you can't always standardize everything. Conceptually, you might think, okay, we can standardize everything, but actually, there are certain processes that are more ripe, certain policies that are more ripe for standardization than others, right? So where we start with this is firstly figuring out where exactly, standardization and harmonization might help you, create more benefit. Remember, efficiency is a ratio. It's benefits upon costs. The first thing we talked about was benchmarking, which is generally you would use that for reducing your costs. Standardization helps you bump up your benefits, the numerator. It helps you get more benefits out of the investment you have. It can also help you reduce your costs. So it looks at both the benefits as well as the cost side of the story. And so the first thing we need to do is identify, okay, maybe if we focus on performance management or learning or hiring, that's where the maximum value, or payroll, that's where the maximum value is. And then you start investigating those processes, right? So because if you try and do everything all at once, it can be quite intimidating unless you have the time and the budget and those kind of things, then it's fine. But otherwise, I would say prioritize the process areas that will give you better results as a result of standardization and harmonization. How do you do that? Benchmark. See where are you spending your time, understand the reasons. Once you've identified this is where we spend most of our time, and the reason is that our processes and policies are all over the place, okay, now you have a candidate identified for standardization or harmonization, okay? For the rest of this presentation, I'll use those words interchangeably. I just wanted to make the point that not everything can be standardized, and standardization is not the same as harmonization. So if we move on and sort of try and understand a little bit more about the difference between process and policy, right? Again, many of us, this might be very, very clear, but also for some of us, we tend to think of these things interchangeably, like not just in the way we say it, but we think about policy as a process sometimes. I've met organizations where they call their processes policies. And there's a bit of a difference between the two, right? So policy is, as you know, perhaps is a formal guidance, right? So it tells you the what and the why, right? The process is the how we do it. So our recruitment policy might say things around, who do we hire, where do we hire from, what kind of selection, criteria is important, those kind of things. But the process will be the actual steps, and when we actually go and hire a person, and the forms that we have to fill, and whatever it may be that you do. So it's the how. It's how you operationalize the policy, right? So I hope that's clear. Policy is something you can standardize, but not always, and I'll come to that. Processes, in most cases, you can standardize unless it's a legal regulatory kind of a process. And over there also, the level of standardization can be very, very high. Processes can be standardized quite, not easily, but they're much easier to standardize than policies. And sometimes standardizing policies don't even give you the kind of benefits that you might imagine when you start. So again, prioritize. Why? Because process is what consumes a lot of time. If you think about it, a lot of our time is spent on doing things, and that's process. So when we standardize a process, we make it lean, we remove the unnecessary steps, and we digitize it perhaps, so we run it faster. Obviously, we end up saving time. That means our cost efficiencies are better. When it comes to policies, so you can imagine very easily, like recruitment process. If you standardize that, your time to fill will be much better. Your time to hire will go down quite significantly if you standardize and digitize that, right? You might get an applicant tracking system and those kind of things. But policy, let's take an example of leave policy. Let's say if we try to standardize leave policy, and especially if you are you're a multinational organization, you're present in multiple countries, the benefit that you will get out of standardizing your leave policy is very minimal. So what most organizations might do is they will standardize what we call those leaves, but the actual allocation or entitlement might still depend on the country that they're in. Because obviously in every country, there's a legal requirement or regulatory requirement on how much leaves we need to provide, entitlements and such. But also beyond that, there's also this competition in the market for talent, right? If everybody else is offering, say, 25 leaves or 30 leaves, then you have to do the same, right? So policy standardization, we've got to be careful on what we are standardizing because not everything will lead to good results or even like any kind of benefit for that matter. But the other thing that's important, and I would consider it, and on the right-hand side on the visual, you can see that balancing act here, right? There is the process and policy, but when you start to harmonize or standardize something, data and systems become extremely important. So this is almost like you need this. You need to have at least a good idea of how your data is, where your data is, and all the systems that are involved in executing a process or enabling a process, right? So on the data front, you need correct information about all your employees. On the systems front, you want to know, which systems are involved in all these steps. You would be surprised if I tell you, I mean, many organizations, even the ones with fairly advanced systems, can have issues just with their data because the data is not up to date, it's not clean, maintenance hasn't been done, or the governance was a bit weak. And it started off as something great, but sort of corrupts over a period of time. So if you pull out a couple of headcount reports and you try and analyze that data, depending on who you ask, the numbers might look different. So this does happen also. So you can understand, right? Because if the data is not accurate and good, then our analysis won't be good, and so on and so forth. Same deal about systems. Once we understand what systems we have and how those systems work, we are able to kind of define a process later that is more efficient, because to enable a process, you might need the right system. Therefore, we need to understand the system. So it's a balance there. What I'm trying to say really is don't harmonize or standardize a process policy without thinking of data and systems. Okay, so policy harmonization, how do you really even choose which policy to harmonize? There's a couple of criteria you can consider. You can see in the middle, it's just a visual that shows policies being harmonized. But you can see there is, how aligned is that strategy, that policy with your strategy? How important is it, right? Is it completely different from what your strategy is? In which case you might want to think about policy standardization. What does it cost? What about compliance? Is the policy falling out of compliance now? Maybe there's a regulatory change. Will standardizing this policy really add big business value, or is it just something we'll feel good about doing, but really adds no impact to the bottom line? What sort of impact will it have on the organizations and employees? How easy is it to standardize? If it's a very complicated policy, then we have to think about the time we'll spend in standardizing it, and how close is it to leading practice? Is everybody else, all the leading organizations, doing something completely different from us? In which case we need to look at the policy again, right? So those are just, it's a sample list, but I think it's a good list. That's the criteria I think you should look at to identify which policies to standardize and which ones you can just let them be like that, as long as you harmonize the process, right? Over here on this slide, I'm showing you a couple of examples on the policies that most organizations, this is just based on my experience, this is not to say that this is the only way to do it, but the ones that you see highlighted in blue are the ones that are mostly standardized by organizations. Again, you could choose another policy for standardization if it's really important and critical to your business objectives, by all means. But you can see things like headcount, job posting, onboarding, organization design, position maintenance. This is data management. Performance management is a big one. Performance and succession is typically standardized because usually you don't have a lot of regulatory requirement tied to how you run your performance management system or performance management process, right? There could be some requirements in certain countries on how do you manage a low performer or exit somebody, but that's a different thing. The steps of performance management might still be the same. So that's another policy and process, in fact, that is also standardized quite a bit. Leadership development, bonuses, service awards. That's just a list for your reference. If you want to standardize another policy because it's important, go for it. Okay, I'm going to touch upon process standardization very quickly and then move on to the thirdly. We're just mindful of the time here, which is about process standardization, right? Now, we cannot cover process standardization in one session like this. It's a topic on its own. But the one thing I'd like to say is when you try to standardize your process, you need to understand who exactly are you designing for in the first place? Design thinking, right? So if you haven't read on design thinking, I would urge you to do that. I think all HR practitioners should read up on design thinking. So we need to start with defining the personas. Personas essentially is a cluster of employees that exhibit similar behavioral patterns. So they're similar in a certain way. This is not about age or gender or those kind of things, right? Although age and gender and those kind of things can play a part in shaping one persona, but that's not what we are classifying by necessarily. So, millennials, for example, could be one persona. New hires could be one persona. Recently promoted people could be another persona. So it's a little more than just demographics, right? It's people with a certain common behavior trait. And the reason it's important is, just like in marketing, when we understand our customers better, we understand what they need, and then we are able to provide them the products or services that we are selling, in a much better manner. Similarly, if we understand our critical employee segments, we've created personas for them. We know we need to win these people. Then we will design a policy or a process that is appropriate to their needs, right? So that's important, because many a times when we go about designing a process, we get a bit too efficiency biased about that, right? Because process redesign is an engineering, borrowed from an engineering domain, and I'm an engineer myself. So we always have an efficiency bias, but you don't want to create something that is extremely efficient, but nobody likes to do it, because that's not how HR works, right? So you need to find that balance. What you see here in front of you is an example of how to go about a persona exercise. So literally, it's just creating a canvas. Here you can see some sample questions. I would urge you, HR and managers and some employees, all of you could get together and start defining this for your organization yourself. Really understand your people and what they need, right? You can see here we're trying to figure out what motivates them, what are their working styles, when do they feel engaged, what challenges do they have. And once we understand this persona type, millennials in this case, then we know, okay, here's what we can do as far as, for example, performance management goes or learning goes and those kind of things. So we can make better processes, better policies. The other thing worth considering before you jump straight into designing a process map. So you should firstly, if you are interested in process standardization, I think you should learn a little bit about BPMN notations, which is a standard nomenclature of how you design a process, because it will be the documentation will be much more useful later if you do that. But what you want to do is, first you want to create a journey map. So we did the persona, we understood who are the people, what do they want, what are their challenges, and those kind of things. Then we design an ideal journey map, right? This is unconstrained thinking. At this stage, I would say, don't worry too much about, do we have the data? Do we have the systems? Do we have the people? Do we have the policy? Don't worry about that too much at this stage. First design what is the ideal journey you want, right? Quite simple. And that's what we call customer journey. We'll call it employee journey. So here you can see, for example, there's an ideal onboarding kind of a journey map that was drawn out, right? Now, of course, what's ideal is you may not be able to realize that today, right away. So the process map is then built on that journey, right? So you try and achieve as much as you can from the ideal journey into the process. But when you design the process, the example you see here, for example, is a performance improvement plan process map. Here you do have to take into consideration data, systems, people, policy, all those things. Because the process has to be enabled. You want the process to go live, not just live as a document, right? People need to work in that manner. But creating that journey map, what it does is it helps you identify what do you want to improve in the process right now in the interim, and what do you want to improve maybe 3 years down the road. Again, helps you prioritize. You can't do everything immediately at the same time. So maybe you do a little bit now and do the rest of it later, but at least your target is clear on what the ideal journey should look like, okay? So don't forget the wow elements. So that's the journey map part of thing, right? The aha moments that matter. So many phrases are being used these days, but ultimately it's about creating a process map or a process that is not just efficient, and cost efficient to run and productivity is high, but also employees, when they go through that process, they feel good about it. So there's an aha moment there. There's a wow moment there. So we have to don't forget about that, because ultimately that leads to a better adoption. Okay, so we've talked about benchmarking, measuring, identifying where the gaps are, and defining those interventions. We've talked about how we standardize processes and policies, or harmonize processes and policies, and what kind of benefits, what are the things to watch out for as you do that. The third thing that I wanted to touch upon is continuous improvement, right? Now, before I go into this, what we have was, because the one thing I'd like to sort of say is there are two things, I think, which I haven't spoken about today in terms of what else you can do for cost efficiency. But I'm sort of assuming that maybe you already know about them, but let's talk about it for maybe 1 minute. Having a good HR technology in place that allows for self-service, like you saw in the case study that I spoke about earlier, is going to do wonders for your cost efficiency, because the speed of your transactions will just improve so significantly. The amount of people that you need to kind of allocate, or HR headcount you need to allocate on getting things done. That paper, if you have a paper-based HR organization today, I would urge at least consider upgrading your HR technology. That would be one easy way to obtain cost efficiency. Initially, it costs something, but typically you get your ROI in a couple of years, and then it's just benefits. So it's investing today for future preparation again. So that's one thing, HR technology. We haven't talked about it today, but there's enough content on Humanica website. If you go there, you can read up about all the HR technology products and why is it good for you, those kind of things. That's one. The other thing that is also very useful in being more cost efficient is deciding what you want to outsource or centralize in a shared service, right? So payroll, classic case. Many clients that I see that have efficient HR organizations have outsourced their payroll, and they manage only by SLAs. So there's no half thing going on, like I do half part of payroll and you do half part of payroll. To be most efficient, you manage by SLAs and just outsource that, right? It's in many cases, it can help you save costs, but beyond saving costs, it helps you free up your time, and therefore your benefits go up. Because when you free up your time, you can do more strategic things. When you do more strategic things, you create better business impact, so the benefits go up. Okay, that said, something else that I think is becoming extremely important in the HR world is continuous improvement. And this is where at Humanica Consulting, we have designed a fairly innovative, we think, way to improve yourself on an ongoing basis. Let's talk about continuous improvement. Why HR sometimes face challenges in continuous improvement. Well, in many cases, HR already has a bit of a capacity issue, very busy. They may not have the right tools to measure, analyze the data and make those decisions. The other thing is that, it's a lot of work, continuous improvement. You have to monitor, you have to analyze, you have to think about what do we do next, how do we improve further. So it's a lot of work. And in some cases, there might be a capability issue as well, right? Maybe you want to do it and you have the time, but you don't have the experts in your organization that know how to kind of analyze the data in the right manner and then figure out the intervention. So if that sounds like your organization, your HR organization, I have the following things to say. Number one, don't try and do everything on your own. Sometimes it's better when you call an expert and that helps you identify what the gaps might be and what are the interventions, and then you can decide to do certain things on your own or not. That's a separate thing, but don't try and do everything on your own. The other one is about regular monitoring and planning. So any kind of benchmarking exercise, let's say you do today, let's say you go ahead and measure everything in your HR organization, leaving it at that, and that day you had all the interventions identified, is not enough. You have to come back to it in a couple of months, weeks, whatever you think is the appropriate time, to see if there are any measurable improvements based on the interventions you just executed, right? So you have to continuously monitor. And the other thing is just be aware of what's the latest in the market, because especially when we talk about processes and policies, it's extremely important that our process and policies are as per the leading practices in the market, right? Otherwise, we may think that we are extremely efficient, our costs are really low and our processes are really quick and we don't spend a lot of headcount, but actually the process itself is antiquated. Everybody else is doing something else, and so you can see why that would not be a good thing for us. So be aware of what's latest in the market. Now, what we are offering here at Humanica Consulting, and this is today, I'm not going to go into too many details. I just wanted to kind of show you how we think we can help with this continuous improvement track. If let's say you already done the benchmarking, your processes are mostly standardized, then it's about continuous improvement, which is what we're calling workforce intelligence as a service, because we identified that in the market there is a bit of a capacity issue, capability issue sometimes even, and a tools issue in other cases. And so what we do really here is, we have a team of experts that can, collect all your data upfront. Of course, the underlying assumption is that you have your HR data in a single place, or at least you know where your data is and it's clean and all that. If not, we help clean it up. But we take your data and we conduct a couple of interviews and surveys to really understand the context, because numbers without context can lead to wrong results. Then we have a team of analysts that will look at very specific things, and I'll show you a few samples today. It's not the entire thing, but we create some hypotheses, we create some baseline analysis, and we say, okay, maybe here's the 4 or 5 things that might be going on in your HR organization. After which we get back and we consult the HR leaders. We sit down with the HR leaders and the business leaders, and initial findings are discussed, see which hypothesis makes sense, which one does not make sense, as a result of which we are able to come up with interventions or recommendations on here's the 5 or 7 things you should do in the short run, medium run, and long term, right? But the other thing that makes this quite unique is this is not a one-time thing. So we're offering this literally as a service. So imagine start of the year, we do that, baselining, we identify interventions, and then every quarter we come back and we track it again and we see if any improvements have been made. If not, why? And then we change those interventions accordingly, right? So it's literally you can repeat that every quarter or whatever frequency you want. So it's literally an advisor along with you at appropriate moments through the year to help you course correct, navigate, measure, continuously improve, right? So that's I think a fairly innovative service. I do not believe this exists in the market at the moment, and we're bringing it through Humanica Consulting. Let me show you a few examples on what this means, right? Oh, the one thing I missed, the other thing we also offer is coaching. Essentially, along the way, even if we have some interventions identified, maybe as you are executing those projects, you have questions, you have doubts, you have concerns. So we also provide some coaching as we go along. So we don't leave you just like that, but we come in every quarter. That's the idea, at least. The other way to enable is to have your own COE that does continuous improvement. If you want to do it in-house, just make sure you hire the right kind of experts, create a continuous improvement COE within HR that focuses on HR matters, and they could follow these steps pretty much. Like I said, if they have the expertise and the data and the tool, there's no reason it can't be done. That's another way to do it. Okay. But I want to show you something that we have created here, some samples today for you. So we're calling this workforce intelligence and not analytics for a reason. As we all know, reports are reports. Basic reports and dashboards have existed for a very long time. Of late, we have started to see analytics being used quite a bit, which is a little more advanced, shows us why certain things are happening, not just what's happening, and gives you some more insights. So there is that. But as far as the workforce intelligence service goes, over there, we are providing you not just analytics, we are providing you recommendations. We're providing you interventions on what you need to do. If this is what's happening, why it's happening, here's what you do, right? And that's why we call it intelligence, not just analytics, because it helps you make decisions, not just look at pretty graphs. But let's look at some pretty graphs anyway. There's a few examples today. Now, the other thing I wanted to sort of very quickly touch upon is most organizations are currently at a stage where they have some kind of HR systems and data available, but they're not able to make the best use of that data from an analytics perspective. That's just my experience. Maybe in your organization it's a little bit different. Maybe you are able to make the best use of all data available to you. Most organizations have a bit of a problem with that. And when you talk about the analytics consulting side of things, people like us who provide consulting services, it's also very ad hoc at the moment. So it's like, okay, I have this problem. Can you solve, can you please come in and solve this problem or identify that? Like I said, that's okay, but that's a one-time intervention, and continuous improvement wise, sometimes you come back 3 years later and things have fallen back to where they were. So, which is why we think this service is fairly innovative, right? Okay, here's a few sample screenshots. So again, this is very, just to give you a flavor, of course, there's a lot of details to this, but this is what we call, for example, our talent flow, right? So any organization, you have new people coming in a given year, you have people going up, you have people who stay in the same grade, no change to them, and you have people who leave, right? So what we do, one of our analysis on talent flow is to look at who are the people joining us, who are the ones going up, who are the ones going out, who are the ones who stay at that place, what are the reasons for that, how long have they stayed in that place, demographics of incoming talent, demographics of outgoing talent. So therefore, what will your organization end up looking in 3 years from now if it continues like this? I think it's an important insight to have about your organization, isn't it? So if you have a diversity and inclusion agenda, but we see something else going on when it comes to exits and hires, then we need to do a few things. That would then become an intervention, just as an example. If we have a lot of people, or we have people in a certain department, certain business unit, certain grade that tend to never get promoted, there's something going on and we need to investigate. If we see a lot of promotions happening in one particular team, there should be a reason for it. So this essentially helps us look at the flow of our talent and what we might do about it. You can see some examples here. For example, how many people in each of the department, how many FTEs did we add, how many did we reduce? All sorts of slices, as we call it, or variations of this analysis is possible. What we've done is come up with standardized ways to analyze all of this. This is just some examples. So net talent gain or loss, you can see here. Another thing we like to analyze quite a bit is performance. So in this particular example, we're looking at, where exactly are your high performers? So you can see in this particular organization, you see a certain, how should I say, clustering of performance levels. And that's an interesting thing. This may mean something, this may not mean something, but what we do really in workforce intelligence as a service is we sit down with you, we look at this, and we try and identify if there is a reason that's driving this, or this is just accidental. And that's one. And two, is it a good thing for us or not? So that's a performance heat map, for example. Again, if you have the data, you have the tools, and you have the specialists, you can do it yourself. Another one, for example, we like to analyze is from for example, from a demographic perspective, what kind of people are joining us and what kind of people are resigning. In certain organizations where you have really high tenured employees, you might want to think about your overall demographic profile a little bit. So that's another example. On performance, for example, we try to create, which we think is a pretty innovative way of thinking about performance, is we call performance personas, right? So who are your rising stars, people who are going up? Who are your fallen angels, as we call it? Used to be high performers, but they're going down. Who are those that are frozen in time? They don't go up, they don't go down, they stay exactly where they are. Because we need to support our people, right? So if we have rising stars, we give them more opportunities. If we have people who are going down, we support them right away. So they don't go down, they come back up. And those frozen in time, we need to understand why they don't go up or sideways and stay just there, right? Maybe it's okay, maybe it's not. We need to investigate. Here you can see a sample analysis on how we also look at how do we pay for performance. So this is a very simplistic way, but we look at the same personas that I was discussing just now. Essentially, we're trying to see if we are rewarding our high performers in a commensurate way or not, right? So you've got high performers and rising stars and all the other personas I talked about, and you can see there are some outliers. The question is, why is it an outlier? Why is it that some high performers are not rewarded as much as, let's say the average performers? These are all good questions. We investigate that as well and get back to you with recommendations. It could be strategy, process, policy, whatever it is, right? Okay, so and there's some other samples here. I think there's an attrition sample here as well. So this is what you end up with at the end of the day, right? I think what's important is not the data, not the analysis, but what are you going to do? So the recommendations part, right? That is the most important thing. No matter which lever we talk about, benchmarking, we talked about process standardization. We now talking about continuous improvement. I touched upon technology and outsourcing or shared services. The main thing is, what are the interventions? All of these things should lead to some action planning and then executing on those actions. And that's that third lever I sort of wanted to talk about. So with that, I think it's enough as far as what we can do. Let's hear from you perhaps and get along.
Thank you, Akshat. That was very informative, and I believe positive, very positive that our audience have learned a lot from you. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
All right. ลำดับต่อไปนะคะเราจะเข้าสู่ช่วง Q&A นะคะหากท่านใดมีคำถามหรือสามารถกดปุ่มยกมือเพื่อสอบถามได้ทันทีนะคะจะภาษาไทยหรือภาษาอังกฤษได้เลยนะคะหรือสามารถพิมพ์ผ่านช่องทางแชทได้เลยนะคะระหว่างที่รอคำถามนะคะตอนนี้เราได้คำถามมาประมาณ2ข้อนะคะ We have received couple of the questions from the audience which actually I just want to ask you the first one is which step that should we start with first? Is there any sequences for this process?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we talked about 3 things, or rather, actually there are 5 things if you include technology and outsourcing in the mix, or shared services. There's no fixed sequence per se, but I recommend. Okay, it depends. Let me put it this way. It depends on where you are, right? So if you really understand your numbers well, you really understand how you are operating in terms of various KPIs and ratios, then benchmarking, you can skip that step, right? And just go into the rest of it straight away. Maybe it's about process standardization, maybe it's about implementing a technology or outsourcing something. But if you're not aware of where you are, you don't know what you don't know, I would say start with the analytics, start with the benchmarking piece. But the rest of it, because benchmarking is, think of it more like a diagnostic, right? Like we go and do a full body health checkup and we know what's right and what's not right.
Yes, correct.
So start there, I think. If you don't know, if you know, then you pretty much, there's no sequence. Pick the one that's important.
Yeah, I agree. Totally agree. We go to the question number 2. What do we have to prepare for this process? Any limitation, or any company can do this process?
Anyone can do it as long as, be it benchmarking, standardization, or any of the other things I just said. Anyone can do it, but there is a bit of a prerequisite, as I say, right? So you do need, remember the data and the systems I was talking about earlier. So you do need some amount of clean data, good data, for anyone to analyze anything. And you do need a reasonably good system to enable your processes, right? So I would say, can anyone do it? Yes, but if you have no control over your data, or it's a bit not so clean, not so up to date, or your systems are just very maybe old and they don't have self-service and those kind of things, then I think the amount of improvements you can bring in by standardization or by even outsourcing for that matter will be very limited. In fact, even outsourcing will not solve that problem, because there's a quotation that we use in the consulting circles, is that you don't outsource a problem, you fix the process first, then you outsource it. So I think data and systems, as long as we can get those right, we'll be fine. You can do any of these things. And if you don't have them, I would say think about the overall transformation roadmap, and maybe it's time for you to start looking at data and systems to really get better value.